My name is Caroline Myers. I'm 42 years old, and I never thought I'd be sitting in a courtroom watching my husband of 16 years laugh as he signs our divorce papers. He looks so smug. His perfectly tailored suit, that ridiculous pen he always bragged about, and the same arrogant smirk I had come to know too well. Edward Grant, the man everyone called a genius CEO, leaned back in his chair, like this entire proceeding was a formality, like he was doing me a favor. Like I was just another disposable chapter in his perfectly curated life. He thought I had nothing, that I would walk away quietly, maybe even beg, that I had spent so long being his shadow that I would vanish the moment he cut me loose. What he didn't know was that I had spent years preparing for this moment. While he was cheating on me with his assistant and hiding money in offshore accounts, I had been building something far more powerful than revenge. The judge cleared her throat and opened the sealed envelope containing my financial statement. Edward was still smiling. I didn't look at him. I just listened. And when the judge began reading aloud the details of my net worth, I finally turned to look at him. His face went pale. His jaw tightened. The pen slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. My husband was laughing, signing our divorce papers. But when the judge read out my net worth, he was frozen to the bones. Let me tell you how I got here. How I went from being the silent, invisible wife to the woman who made him tremble with nothing but the truth. And how, in the end, it wasn't just about money. It was about freedom. 16 years ago, I thought I had found my fairy tale. I was teaching English literature at a small private school in Austin, Texas. I loved my job. I loved the quiet satisfaction of watching students discover poetry of grading essays late into the night with a cup of tea. I lived a modest but content life, sharing a rental home with my cat, a garden of potted herbs on the balcony, and dreams that were simple but sincere. Then I met Edward Grant. He was introduced to me through a mutual friend at a local charity auction. At the time, Ed had just launched his own fintech startup. Everyone in the room seemed drawn to him. He had that magnetic energy, confident, charming, full of grand ideas and ambition. I remember thinking he was unlike anyone I had ever met. He told me I had eyes that saw more than most, and I was flattered. For a woman who spent most of her time with books and teenagers, his attention felt like sunshine. We dated for only 9 months before he proposed. The proposal came during a weekend in Napa Valley. Rose's Wine, a private vineyard tour, the kind of thing I had only read about. I said yes. At first, it felt like I had stepped into another life, one with dinner parties, fundraisers, vacations to the coast, and designer everything. I quit my job at his request. Why deal with ungrateful students and school politics, he said, when you could help me build an empire? He made it sound like I'd be his equal partner, and I believed him. But the shift was slow. It started with little suggestions. I should speak less at networking events. I should stop wearing my favorite old cardigans, they didn't fit the image. I should get a new haircut, learn to play tennis, and stop discussing books so often. Then came the financial control. At first it was subtle. I'll handle the bank stuff, he said. It's easier that way. Soon after, I no longer had access to any accounts. I received a monthly allowance. He called it household efficiency. I called it suffocating. Friends started to drift. I was either too tired or too embarrassed to explain why I missed their birthdays, why I never called back, or why I couldn't meet for coffee without checking Ed's calendar first. Even my family noticed. My sister once pulled me aside during Thanksgiving and said, "You don't sound like you anymore." I smiled and told her I was fine. What else could I say? Over the years, I became a ghost in my own life. I smiled at the right times, dressed the way he preferred, and supported his public image as the brilliant founder with the loving wife. Behind closed doors, I was small, invisible, managing dinner parties, vetting his speeches, coordinating board dinners, always in the background. The Caroline who used to recite Shakespeare in class, who dreamed of writing a novel, who once argued passionately about Sylvia Plath, was fading. I looked in the mirror one morning and didn't recognize the woman brushing her hair. Perfect nails, wrinkle cream, and hollow eyes. Ed didn't yell, he didn't hit, but the damage was real. His tools were silent, subtle condescension and perfect timing. If I cried, I was being dramatic. If I disagreed, I was being emotional. If I needed space, I was being distant. He twisted the truth so gently, so cleverly. I began to question my own reality. And still I stayed, because I didn't know who I was without him. Because he made me believe I was lucky to be chosen. Because he had rewritten the story of us so many times I forgot the original. I convinced myself this was how marriage worked. That comfort came at the cost of freedom. That love meant compromise. That silence was easier than confrontation. Until one day it wasn't. The unraveling of our marriage didn't happen overnight. Like most slow suffocations, it was a quiet, creeping thing. By the time I realized how far I had fallen, I had been living under Ed's thumb for nearly a decade. He controlled everything: the money, the calendar, the narrative. On paper, it looked like I had it all. A beautiful home just outside downtown Austin, invitations to exclusive events, custom-tailored clothes, and a husband who was frequently featured in business magazines. People admired us. They thought I was lucky. I smiled politely when they said that. But inside our house, I had no say. Ed started calling me his chief life officer. He said it jokingly at first during dinner with his investors. Caroline keeps me alive and functioning, he'd laugh. Without her, I'd be living on protein bars and sleeping under my desk. Everyone chuckled. I forced a smile, but the title stuck not as a compliment, but as a boundary. I managed his life, but had none of my own. He gave me a black Amex card, but every transaction was monitored. If I bought something he didn't pre-approve, I'd find the charge printed out and highlighted sitting on the kitchen counter with a note. Did we really need another cookbook? I started paying for small things with my old debit card, the one I had before we got married. He never noticed it at first. I kept it for grocery runs or bookstore splurges when I needed to feel like myself for just a moment. I had no formal job yet. My days were full organizing his calendar, overseeing our house staff, keeping up appearances. I wasn't a wife. I was a high-functioning assistant with wedding photos. Ed rarely raised his voice, but when he did, it was precise. Ice cold. Like the night I brought up the idea of going back to teaching. Just a few classes at a local college. Something for me. He laughed. Actually laughed. "Caroline, darling," he said, refilling his scotch. "Why would a woman married to a man with a seven-figure income want to teach poetry to underpaid kids? Do you want people to think I can't provide?" It wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict. I stopped mentioning my ideas. I stopped asking for more. Around our 12th anniversary, the distance between us grew even larger. Ed had taken to working late, often past midnight. He said it was investor calls with Singapore or last-minute pitch decks. I stopped waiting up. I'd lie in our king-size bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the tick of the old clock I had brought from my childhood home. That clock was the last thing in the house that still belonged to me. It was during one of those nights when I finally mustered the courage to ask him directly that things shifted. "Are you seeing someone else?" I asked. Not even angry, just tired. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. Instead, he sipped his drink and said, "You're imagining things, Caroline. You really should stop reading so many mystery novels." That's when I knew. Not because he admitted it, Ed would never hand me that, but because his lie was too well rehearsed. After that, the emotional abuse became sharper. He started commenting on my weight, my aging skin, my voice at dinner parties. He suggested I upgrade my wardrobe with brands that fit mature women better. I was 40. He also began suggesting I see a therapist not for healing, but so I could get my head straight. I went once. The therapist asked too many real questions. I never returned. Meanwhile, his own life flourished. His company secured a massive Series C funding round. He was featured in a Forbes Top 40 Under 40 profile. I was mentioned once as his elegant and supportive wife. I became invisible even in print. What Ed didn't know, what he could never imagine, was that I had started taking notes. Not metaphorically, literally. I kept a journal hidden behind the panel of our master bedroom's built-in shelving. I recorded every demeaning comment, every strange financial move, every time he came home, smelling like expensive perfume and lies. I documented the inconsistencies, the names he dropped, the hotel charges that didn't match any conference he told me about. It wasn't just hurt feelings anymore. It was data, patterns, proof. Somewhere deep inside me, the old Caroline, the teacher, the reader, the woman who once dreamed of writing a novel was waking up. She was angry, and she was done being small. I don't remember the exact day it changed. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No screaming, no slamming doors. Just a quiet realization over cold coffee on a Thursday morning: if I stayed, I would disappear. Not physically, I would still walk, breathe, speak. But the parts that made me, my curiosity, my voice, my self-worth, were slowly dying. And Edward didn't see it. Or worse, he did, and didn't care. That was the day I started planning. It began with small steps. I created a new email account under a pseudonym C.M. Harlan, a variation of my full name untraceable to Ed. I reopened an old checking account I had back when I was a teacher and set up a digital wallet. Every month I skimmed off tiny amounts from the household budget, just enough not to raise suspicion, and deposited them there. $50 here, $85 there. It was slow, but it was mine. Next, I began freelancing online. I had always loved writing, so I pitched articles under my pseudonym to small lifestyle blogs and women's magazines. One accepted, then another. Soon I was ghostwriting newsletters, social media posts, even a speech for a local mayoral candidate's wife. I worked while Ed slept, typing in the guest bathroom so the keystrokes wouldn't wake him. It felt good, no, it felt real to have something of my own again. Then something unexpected happened. A small indie publisher read one of my freelance pieces and asked if I'd be interested in doing some consulting. They were trying to expand their digital presence but didn't know where to begin. I told them I could help. I had no experience in digital strategy, but I had spent over a decade planning high-profile events for Ed, organizing donor galas, formatting pitch decks, and managing his online presence. I knew storytelling. I knew image. I just never thought of applying it for anyone but him. That job turned into a project. That project turned into a referral. Before long, I was doing consulting work for 2 more boutique publishers and a local author collective. I converted the attic space in our home into a private office. I told Ed it was for organizing the household and storing seasonal items. He never went up there. As long as dinner was served and his dry cleaning was handled, I was invisible, which worked in my favor. During this time, I also began reading obsessively about business structures, LLCs, taxes, copyrights, and content licensing. I downloaded legal templates, hired a virtual assistant under my pseudonym, and built a brand, Harlan Creative Works. It was just me, a laptop, and a mission. I reinvested every dollar I made, paid cash for software, hired a designer to create a sleek website, took an online course on social media growth for publishers. My days were still filled with managing Ed's world, but my nights were mine. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I was building. One evening, while waiting for Ed to return from yet another offsite strategy retreat, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine and stared at the city skyline. My laptop was open to my latest invoice, $3,500 for a campaign I had created for a poetry imprint. $3,500. More than my monthly allowance. More than he ever thought I was worth. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just felt awake. In secret, I opened a business account, registered my LLC under a third-party address, began building an investment portfolio. I studied market trends, emerging startups, and creative tech, and began putting small amounts into fractional shares and funds that prioritized women-owned companies. It was exhilarating. But I was careful. Ed never suspected a thing. If anything, he was more distant than ever, consumed with expanding his business and attending endless networking trips. He liked me quiet, predictable, the perfect shadow, and I gave him exactly that. But beneath the stillness, something powerful was forming. Each contract I signed, each client I impressed, each dollar I earned and protected became a brick in the foundation of my escape. Not a reckless bolt in the night, not a tearful goodbye, but a controlled, deliberate exit. One day, while organizing our kitchen drawer, I found a card from Ed's law firm, Holland & Pierce LLP, tucked behind a stack of takeout menus. My hands froze. That firm specialized in high-asset divorces. My throat tightened. I had seen no formal documents, but now I knew he was preparing. probably hoping to blindside me with paperwork, assume I'd accept whatever offer he made, and walk away with nothing. What he didn't know was that I had already begun packing financially, emotionally, and legally. Let him laugh. Let him think I was small. Let him think I'd break. He had no idea who he married. And I was about to remind him. Once I realized Ed might already be preparing for divorce, everything sharpened. I no longer had the luxury of hesitation. I needed facts, evidence, leverage, and I needed them quietly. For years, I had accepted the opaque way Ed handled our finances, trusting that what I didn't understand wasn't important. Now I saw it for what it was, a cage disguised as convenience. So I started digging. It began innocently enough. I searched our shared home office late at night pretending to tidy up. I went through old tax documents, receipts, quarterly investment reports. Ed was meticulous, but he was also arrogant, and arrogance makes people sloppy. Tucked in the back of a filing cabinet was a folder labeled personal. Inside were statements from accounts I didn't recognize, foreign banks in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. One had transactions totaling over $400,000 in a single year, all dated within our marriage, all hidden. My hands trembled as I took photos with my burner phone. Then came the emails. Ed had a work laptop and a personal desktop, both password protected. The work laptop had state-of-the-art security, but the desktop, it was older, used mostly for gaming or casual browsing, and surprisingly vulnerable. One evening while Ed was in Chicago on a client retreat, I used an old trick I had learned as a teacher, the password reset loop through security questions. I knew the answers: his mother's maiden name, our anniversary, the name of his first dog. I was in. And what I found was more than I expected. There were hundreds of emails between Ed and his assistant, Lila. Some flirty, some explicit, some with hotel confirmations and receipts. But worse than the affair were the attachments: spreadsheets, tax reports, internal company documents he shouldn't have had access to, emails discussing how to reclassify certain investor funds as operational development to avoid triggering reporting thresholds. He was manipulating his company's finances. I wasn't a CPA, but even I could see this wasn't just unethical, it was likely illegal. I downloaded everything. For weeks, I kept collecting. I found burner phones hidden in the back of his gym bag. I discovered a separate mailbox he used for confidential packages, opened under a fake company name. I documented each discovery with date-stamped photos, organized them into folders, encrypted everything onto a secure drive, and stored it in a rented safe deposit box under my business name. Then I contacted someone I never thought I'd need, a forensic accountant. Her name was Leslie Hart, and she worked with women preparing for high-asset divorces. I found her through a financial literacy podcast for women, one I'd started listening to religiously. When we met, I brought her a black USB stick and 2 notebooks filled with handwritten records. She didn't blink. She took it all, scanned quickly through my summaries, and said, "You've done most of my job already." In the weeks that followed, Leslie uncovered more. Ed had funneled money through dummy corporations, companies that existed only on paper. He had moved assets between family members and used loopholes to hide his true net worth. According to Leslie, he had stashed away nearly $2.3 million in undeclared income. And because we were still legally married, half of it was marital property. It was a game to him, a chess match he assumed I didn't know how to play. But I wasn't just watching anymore. I was studying the board, tracking every move, waiting for the right moment to counter. My lawyer, Marcia Lynn, was sharp and unshakable. When I showed her what I had gathered, she nodded slowly and said, "He's built a fortress. But you, Caroline, you've mapped every wall." We began planning. Our strategy was twofold: protect my business and expose his deception. The first part involved restructuring Harlan Creative Works to ensure it would be treated as separate property. We compiled every receipt, timeline, and contract to prove it was built without Ed's knowledge or involvement. The second part required timing. If we exposed Ed too soon, he'd bury the rest of the evidence. We needed to wait until court, where he would be forced to testify and where the consequences of lying under oath would be real. During those months of preparation, I played my role perfectly. I hosted his dinner parties. I nodded through his monologues. I stood beside him at charity galas, arm linked through his smiling at photographers, while he whispered promises into another woman's ear. He had no idea what I knew, no idea what I was building, and no idea what was coming. Then one evening I came home earlier than expected. His voice echoed through the house as I stepped through the door. "You don't need to worry about her. She's harmless. She doesn't even know what a balance sheet is." I walked into the living room and found him on the phone, whiskey in hand. He looked up startled. I said nothing. I just smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I knew his words would be the last time he ever underestimated me. He had built a world on secrets, and I was about to burn it down with the truth. Once we had the evidence, the next step was preparation, meticulous, strategic, and emotionally draining. Marcia and Leslie worked like surgeons. Every dollar, every timestamp, every email was placed into a legal mosaic that showed Ed's hidden financial life. But this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power, control, narrative. And we were about to take it back. We filed the divorce petition first. That small act alone flipped the balance of power. Ed had expected to be the one to deliver the blow. Instead, it arrived from a law office in downtown Austin with a courier and a quiet formality that left no room for games. He didn't call. Instead, he sent a carefully crafted email, polite and corporate in tone, asking if we could resolve this amicably without unnecessary drama. I replied with 3 words: "Please contact Marcia." From that point forward, we spoke only through attorneys. Ed's lawyer, a sharp, seasoned man named Donald Carr, sent over a proposed settlement. It was almost insulting. A modest monthly stipend for 1 year, no claim to the home, no stake in any shared assets or investments, and an NDA so broad it would have barred me from even writing a memoir about my life experience. I declined. Through Marcia, I made our stance clear: full disclosure of all marital assets, forensic review of business holdings, and a fair division as per Texas law. No games. Within 2 weeks, their tone changed. Ed's team requested delays. They filed for extensions. They claimed documents were unavailable or lost in a system migration. Standard tactics meant to wear me down, deplete my patience and financial resources. But I had been preparing for this for over 2 years, and I was ready. In parallel, we worked to insulate Harlan Creative Works from becoming marital property. Leslie and Marcia built a case proving that the business had been started without Ed's knowledge or support. Every dollar used was traceable to my freelance income. Every asset was paid for in cash or through my independent business accounts. There was no crossover, no dependency. I kept operating the company quietly, fulfilling contracts, securing new clients, and growing my portfolio. I even hired a project manager under contract to handle the overflow, someone who had no idea I was in the middle of a legal firestorm. By the time the preliminary court hearing arrived, Harlan Creative Works had 3 full-time retainers, a 6-figure pipeline, and a client roster that included 2 indie publishers and a growing author collective out of Portland. Marcia insisted I keep all documentation ready in a sealed folder, cleanly printed, bookmarked, and organized. "You won't need to show this until the right moment," she said. "And when you do, it will change everything." Meanwhile, Ed moved out of the house and into a luxury apartment near his office. I didn't contest it. I didn't ask for alimony. I didn't engage with his passive-aggressive notes left behind, things like, "Hope you enjoy the silence." And "Don't forget who paid for all this." Let him think I was broken. It made the truth hit harder later. What he never knew was that I had already secured a new place of my own, a penthouse loft overlooking Lady Bird Lake, purchased under Harlan Creatives LLC, funded entirely by my business income and investment returns. I had kept the purchase quiet, only telling Marcia and my accountant. I furnished it slowly, thoughtfully. No cold minimalism like Ed preferred. There were shelves of books, antique lamps, and a record player I'd found at a vintage shop. I chose every piece not for status, but for comfort. For me. The day I stood alone in that space, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor, I felt something I hadn't in years: safe and stronger than I had ever been. Still, I knew the courtroom would be the final test, the place where masks fall, where posturing and manipulation are peeled back by the weight of evidence and silence. Marcia called the night before our trial. She didn't offer grand speeches or predictions, just one simple sentence: "Be calm, be clear, and let the truth speak louder than anything he ever said." I went to bed early, printed one final copy of my financial declaration, and zipped it into a navy leather folder. Then I lay awake for hours, not because I was afraid, but because tomorrow, for the first time in 16 years, I wouldn't be defending myself. I would be revealing myself. The courthouse was colder than I expected. I arrived early dressed in a slate gray suit that had clean lines and quiet confidence. No flashy jewelry, no designer logos. Just a small silver necklace my mother's something I hadn't worn in years. It reminded me of who I had been before Ed and who I had fought to become again. Marcia joined me in the hallway outside the courtroom, calm and focused. She reviewed her notes, then looked up at me. "Whatever happens today," she said, "you're walking out of here with the truth on your side. And that's more powerful than anything he can buy." I nodded. Then Ed arrived. He strolled in flanked by Donald Carr and two junior associates. He wore a tailored navy suit and a tie I had picked out for him years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. He looked smug confident, as if this were another board meeting he would dominate with charm and swagger. He didn't even look at me as he walked by. In the courtroom, Judge Karen Hollis presided, known for being firm, fair, and immune to theatrics. A woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense presence. I had read about her. She had a reputation for seeing through financial smokescreens. The opening arguments were predictable. Donald Carr painted Ed as a supportive husband who had funded our lifestyle, encouraged my creative pursuits, and now wanted a dignified resolution. They framed our marriage as harmonious and me as the one who changed. Mrs. Grant chose to step away from the marriage emotionally and now seeks financial compensation disproportionate to her contribution, he said. I kept my face neutral. When Marcia stood to speak, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply began laying down facts. First, she presented our financial history, the joint accounts, the sudden transfers, the unexplained offshore activity. She introduced documents we had gathered through Discovery Bank statements, transfer records, and tax anomalies. Ed shifted in his chair. His eyes narrowed. Then Marcia presented the business activity, how Ed had moved money through shell corporations, rerouted investments, and failed to disclose major income. She didn't accuse him of crimes. She simply raised the question of credibility and transparency in a marriage where financial trust had clearly eroded. That was the moment Ed broke his silence. He leaned over to Donald and whispered urgently. Donald stood, objected, claimed. These matters were irrelevant to the divorce proceedings and pertained to business operations. Judge Hollis raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Carr, if Mr. Grant's financial conduct during the marriage impacted the division of marital assets, I will allow this line of evidence. Please sit." Donald hesitated, then did as told. Now Ed looked less sure. But it wasn't until Marcia turned to me and said, "Your Honor, we would now like to submit the full and updated financial disclosure for Mrs. Grant," that the energy in the room shifted. I opened my leather folder and passed the sealed envelope to the court clerk. Judge Hollis read it silently for nearly a full minute. Then she spoke. "For the record, Mrs. Caroline Grant reports total personal and business assets in the amount of $4.9 million, including a fully owned business entity, Harlan Creative Works LLC, valued at $2.8 million, and an investment portfolio totaling $1.4 million. Additionally, she holds ownership of real property under an LLC registered in her name." She looked up. "Mr. Grant, were you aware of these assets?" Ed didn't answer. Donald stood and stammered something about surprise declarations and lack of transparency. But it was empty noise, because now the courtroom belonged to the truth. Marcia continued. She presented my client contracts dated back over 3 years, my investment trail, my business licenses, the declaration from Leslie Hart confirming the business was built without Ed's knowledge or support, and most importantly, the clause. Judge Hollis turned to the prenuptial agreement. Paragraph 14. Any business established independently by either spouse without use of shared marital funds or spousal investment shall be considered separate property unless otherwise contested and proven. It was Ed's own prenup crafted by his lawyers that now shielded me. His face drained of color. Marcia didn't stop there. She calmly walked the court through the extensive pattern of concealment and manipulation Ed had engaged in. She noted the offshore accounts, the hidden investments, the misclassified business expenditures. She introduced email communications and correspondence, showing his deliberate efforts to avoid equitable disclosure. Finally, she said, "Your Honor, we respectfully request the court take these factors into account when determining asset division, particularly given Mr. Grant's attempt to portray my client as financially dependent and entitled." Silence followed. Judge Hollis asked if I had anything I wished to say directly. I stood palm steady. "I spent over a decade of my life believing I had no voice," I said quietly. "I was told I didn't understand money, that I didn't contribute, that I was lucky to be chosen. For a long time, I believed it. But while he was hiding money and writing off our marriage, I was rebuilding myself. Every penny I earned came from the hours I worked while he was asleep or away. I didn't take from him. I freed myself from him." Judge Hollis nodded once. "I believe I've heard enough." She recessed for 30 minutes to review the evidence. Ed wouldn't look at me. When court resumed, the judge delivered her ruling my business and investments were to be recognized as separate property. Given Ed's repeated lack of disclosure and the proven financial manipulation, the court awarded me a 60% share of the remaining marital assets, including profits from the sale of the house and shared accounts. Judge Hollis concluded with a single sentence that echoed in my chest. "This court does not reward deception, Mr. Grant." As we exited the courtroom, Ed rushed after me. His voice was a whisper, sharp and desperate. "You planned this. You used me." I looked at him finally and clearly. "No, Ed, I survived you." And then I walked out, not as a wife, but as a woman finally free. The days following the verdict felt strangely quiet. There was no dramatic scene, no sudden collapse of Ed's empire in the public square. That would come later slowly, like the way winter eats a tree from its roots before the leaves even fall. But in that courtroom, with every sentence the judge read, Ed lost what he prized most, his illusion of control. The ruling spread fast through our social circle. People who had once smiled tightly at me at dinner parties now whispered behind their hands. Some sent polite, curious texts. Others disappeared altogether, unsure which version of me to believe, the quiet wife or the woman who just dismantled a millionaire's narrative in court. But I didn't care. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was free. Ed, however, couldn't accept it. 2 days after court, his assistant Lila resigned. A week later, a formal inquiry was launched by his board of directors after an anonymous report. Anonymous, but backed by irrefutable documentation, revealed inconsistencies in financial reporting and questionable off-the-books transactions. I had nothing to do with the inquiry directly, but I had given Marcia everything we discovered, and it's not difficult to imagine how that information found its way into the right hands. Ed's carefully curated persona began to crack. Articles started appearing, first subtle, then explicit, questioning his leadership, his ethics, his management of investor funds. He called me twice, both times from an unknown number. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked through my new home barefoot on warm wooden floors, sunlight pouring in through tall windows. The furniture was mine. The books were mine. Even the silence, once unbearable, now felt peaceful. The real liberation didn't come from money or victory in court. It came from the stillness, the absence of tension, the lack of fear. One afternoon, I sat at my kitchen counter and reread one of the old journal entries I had written during those years in silence. A line stood out. "If I disappear, will anyone notice I noticed?" I brought myself back. That week, I made the decision to take Harlan Creative Works public, not in a traditional IPO sense, but public in presence. I stepped out from behind the pseudonym, updated the website to list my full name, created a LinkedIn profile, posted the first blog under my name, a piece titled "Why Silence Doesn't Protect You." It went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Emails flooded in from women across the country, some married, some divorced, some still trapped in versions of the life I had escaped. They thanked me for speaking the words they hadn't dared to say. I replied to every message. I knew what it meant to feel invisible. One message came from a woman in Arizona who wrote, "Reading your story made me realize I'm not crazy, I'm just controlled." I cried. Then I got to work. Within a month, I created a digital support hub under Harlan Creative called The Second Voice, a free resource library for women rebuilding after financial abuse, emotional manipulation, or controlling relationships. It wasn't flashy, but it was real, practical, needed. I partnered with 2 lawyers and 1 therapist to provide basic guidance. I hired a former nonprofit director to help manage the flow, and I funded the first year entirely myself. Because the most important thing I'd learned was this liberation doesn't end in a courtroom. It begins the moment you stop asking permission to exist. And I was finally done asking. 6 weeks after the court ruling, I left the house Ed and I had once shared for the last time. The movers came early. I had already boxed what I wanted: books, photos, a few keepsakes, and the kitchen mixer I bought with my own money during the early freelance days. Everything else I left behind. Furniture, artwork, even the silk rug Ed had insisted we import from Paris. I didn't want anything that reminded me of who I was supposed to be in that house. My new home, a light-filled loft on the east side of the city, was everything the last one wasn't. Open, warm, mine. The first night I slept there, I woke up at 3 a.m., not from nightmares, but from a strange stillness. I lay in bed blinking at the ceiling, realizing I didn't feel afraid. No dread about what mood Ed would be in the next morning. No anxiety about saying the wrong thing. Just quiet. Just peace. And in that silence, I began to heal. It wasn't a straight line. There were days I missed the routine of my old life, not the control, but the predictability. There were moments I heard Ed's voice in my head, telling me I was being dramatic or selfish or naive. Old echoes take time to fade. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Monroe, a soft-spoken woman with sharp questions. She helped me unravel the years of micro-shaming and subtle manipulation. We talked not just about Ed, but about the version of myself that had allowed his voice to become louder than my own. "You didn't fail," she told me once. "You adapted. And now you're unlearning." That reframed everything. I poured more energy into Harlan Creative and The Second Voice. We expanded services, added a live Q&A webinar each month, and built partnerships with local women's shelters. We even launched a grant fund, small at first, but real, designed to help women start over even if they had nothing. Every story I heard added fuel to my mission. One woman in Oregon wrote, "My husband says I'll never survive without him. Your story made me start packing." That was when I knew this wasn't just business anymore. It was purpose. I reconnected with my sister and started visiting my parents again. The first dinner back at their house was awkward. They didn't know what to say. But after dessert, my dad reached over, placed his hand on mine, and said, "You got out. That's more than most can say. We're proud of you." I wept that night, not from grief, but from the strange beauty of returning to yourself. My body felt lighter. My laughter came easier. And for the first time in years, I looked in the mirror and saw me, not the wife, not the assistant, not the ghost. Just Caroline, reclaimed, redefined, resilient. Almost a year to the day after the divorce was finalized, I saw Ed again. It was at a charity gala downtown, one I had once helped plan during the early years of our marriage. This time I wasn't behind the scenes arranging place cards and managing guest lists. I was a featured donor. Harlan Creative had sponsored a grant program for women entrepreneurs, and I had been invited to speak briefly about the importance of financial independence. As I stepped into the ballroom, I felt eyes on me, but not the way I used to. Not judgment, not pity, just recognition. I saw Ed near the bar, standing stiffly in an expensive suit that somehow looked tighter than usual. His once ever-present entourage of investors and admirers was nowhere in sight. There was a woman by his side, younger, visibly uncomfortable. Not Lila. He noticed me before I approached the stage. His eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. He looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't. After my speech, he made his move. He caught me near the hallway outside the coat check, his voice lower, more cautious than I'd ever heard. "You look different." I nodded. "I am." He gave a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. I've heard things about your company. You've done well? I have. There was a pause. Then he said it. I didn't see it. Back then. I didn't see who you really were. I looked at him carefully. This man I once adored feared tiptoed around. He wasn't scary anymore. He was smaller somehow, shrinking into the story he could no longer control. That's because you never looked, I said. He sighed. We could have been something great, you know. A power couple. You and me. I didn't laugh. I didn't roll my eyes. I just said it softly. You wanted a mirror, not a partner. That's the difference. His mouth opened, then closed. For once he had nothing to say. I turned to go. You know I did love you once, he said. I didn't turn around. I believe you, but I also believe you love power more. That was the last time I saw him. Later that evening, I joined my team on the terrace sipping champagne under string lights, watching the city skyline shimmer in the distance. No bitterness, no revenge speech, just a quiet knowing. I didn't destroy him. The truth did, and it saved me. Not just from him, but from the version of myself that thought I needed his permission to exist. I had walked through the fire, not unburned, but rebuilt. My net worth wasn't just a number in a courtroom. It was every boundary I had learned to hold. Every voice I had helped others find. Every day I woke up and chose myself. And that more than anything was the beginning of everything.